Hey there, welcome to Module 7 of the Sattin Farm course. This module is all about crop planning. And before we get into it, I just have to have a huge thanks to Paywall Co. for sponsoring this entire course. Without the help of Diego and Paywall Co., this entire course wouldn't be possible, and more on them later. In this module, I'll talk about overall considerations and how your crop plan will depend on your sales outlets. I'll talk about succession planting and seasonality, my personal crop strategy, some timing, transplants, talk about a little bit about harvesting, and some other tips. Let's start this off by talking about overall considerations. And I think the first thing you have to think about is what you want to grow. Hopefully you already saw Module 3. That one was all about crop selection. If you haven't, go check that out. It'll help you figure out what you want to grow. Once you figure out what you want to grow, you have to figure out your crop plan. And the best time to think about this is not during your season. So for most people, their off season is winter time, and that's when you should be doing your crop plan. You should then be thinking about what you want to grow, how much of each crop you want to grow, and that will determine what seeds you need to order and how much of each seed that you'll need for the season. And I really recommend doing that when it's not busy, because during your season, during the spring and summer, you're going to be super busy planting and harvesting and working on the field. You're going to be tired. You know, there will be some audibles that you'll have to call during the season. You'll be making some adjustments on the fly for sure, but spend the time when things are quiet and you have a lot of brain space to think about your crop plan. You'll do a much better job with that. Now, I can't stress this enough about crop planning, that there is no playbook. There is no follow these things and you'll be successful. Now, when I first started my farm, I kind of did that. I was following some other people's playbooks and they didn't really work for me. Either my context here, my sales outlets, my ability to grow certain crops as a farmer, all those things. So what I've been stressing during this entire course is that I will give you the guidelines, the ideas, the frameworks to think about this and strategies so that you can form your own plan. And that way you'll really understand it and make it work for you. So the thing that you really want to start thinking about is obviously, your crop selection, what you want to grow, but how much you'll need of each crop per week. For example, if you need 50 pounds of lettuce every week, well, then you have to figure out how to grow 50 pounds of lettuce each week and have it ready to harvest. This takes a lot of time and practice and record keeping and experience. This stuff doesn't just come right away. It takes time from season to season and learning how to grow things and figuring out how long they take and the yields that you're getting in your system and those kinds of things. There are a variety of approaches to crop planning. Some people are super detailed, super specific, down to the week in terms of what they're planting, what they're harvesting. And I think that, as I said, that takes a lot of time and experience and years of learning how to grow and taking notes. And then there's people that don't crop plant a lot. I'm kind of in the middle, and I'll talk about my crop planting strategy in a little bit. But keep in mind, you need to figure out what works for you, your farm, and your farm business. Your crop plan will depend a lot on your sales outlets and how you're selling your produce. So we'll talk about the different sales outlets right now. So we'll start with restaurants because that's my jam, right? I sell only to restaurants. The biggest thing that I found is important with crop planning for selling to restaurants is consistency. Consistency in the amount of product, but also the quality. So once you start selling to a restaurant, generally, they'll be buying roughly the same amount from you every week. Of course, it'll fluctuate a little bit depending on how busy they are and those sorts of things. But for example, I sell a lot of lettuce, and there's certain restaurants that buy, a specific amount every week. If it's 10 pounds, if it's 15 pounds, and they are relying on that as their source of lettuce. Now, if I don't have it one week or a couple weeks or whatever, they have other ways to get lettuce, but they're purposely buying from me because they like my products, they like my farm, they like me, whatever. Generally, it's the products, they speak for themselves. But you want to make sure that you have that for them week to week, and that's really what's going to sell your relationship and sell your products is like, yep, I have lettuce every week, you can rely on it, and that's going to be super important. So that will take some planning with succession planting and learning how to do that. We'll get into that a little bit later. Now, when it comes to CSAs, as I said in previous modules, I think this is the hardest sales outlet, mainly because the execution is very difficult. I recommend you have about 6 to 10 items per week in your CSA box. And if you think about that, you have to have 6 to 10 items that are ready to harvest every single week. Now that takes incredible crop planning and knowledge about a lot of different crops. If you are growing a bunch of things and one week you have 15 things ready and one week you have 3 things ready, That's not going to work. I found that the CSA farmers that are super successful are really good at crop planning. And it's not just like laying things out like in a spreadsheet or on paper or whatever. It's the knowledge of each crop, how long they take at certain times of year, and when they're going to be ready to harvest. And then they'll basically have every box sort of outlined, every week sort of outlined. And there'll be some things that'll be variable, of course, for things growing quicker or slower, crop failures, those kinds of things. But I think it's a very structured plan with a CSA. If you go willy-nilly with crop planning on CSA farms, you're not going to be very successful. Now, the farmer's market, I think, is kind of a mixture of consistency and seasonality, because I recommend that if you are selling to a farmer's market, you have a few products that people kind of want every week. Like if you are the guy that has great salad mix, they'll come to you because they know they want to buy a bag or two of salad for their for the family for the week, and then they'll check out what else you have. The great thing is you can bring whatever you want to the farmer's market, as I mentioned before, and it's a great place to get started selling your produce. But there can be some seasonality to it too. Of course, like during the spring, summer, and fall and winter, you're growing some different things, and that can kind of keep people's attention, keep people's interest in your farm stand, and allow you to sell more products to your customers. If you only have 2 or 3 products every week, then your average sale price per customer is going to be lower. But if you can bring a couple more items in, I think that's great, and people love it. And when you have regular customers, you can let them know that things are coming up. You're like, hey, we're gonna have squash in 2 weeks, get excited for that, blah, blah, blah. So having a mixture of consistency and seasonality, I think, is great for farm stand sales. Seasonality plays a huge role in crop planning. And then first and probably most obvious thing is you want to plant certain crops during times of year where they grow really well. So for example, you're not going to grow tomatoes in the wintertime. And there's certain crops that you probably wouldn't grow in the summertime, especially here in North Carolina where it's pretty warm in the summer. So not just when during the year crops do well, but also insect pressure and those sorts of things. We'll talk about that in another module, but there's certain crops that you probably only want to grow at a certain time of the year. In addition to which crops to grow, you have to keep in mind how long the crops take to get to the point where you're going to harvest them. This is what's known as the days to maturity. Like how many days does it take until you harvest it? These are listed in seed catalogs, websites. A lot of seed packages will say carrots, 60 days, for example. Those numbers are based on the middle of the season, and it will vary depending on what time of the year you're planting things. For example, in the spring and fall, what's known as the shoulder seasons, things will grow more slowly, of course, even more slowly in the wintertime. And the reason for that is there's less light and there's less heat. So you have to keep that in mind. Now, when we're talking about succession planting, that's when you're planting successions of a certain crop so you have a consistent output. You need to take that into consideration, because if you start planting in the spring, let's say you plant 2 beds that are 3 weeks apart. Well, as those start to grow towards summer, the days are longer, there's more heat. The one that you planted later will start to catch up, and it becomes almost exponential. And so when you plant something maybe 3 weeks apart, it might be ready only a week apart. And the opposite is true in the fall. So depending on how late in the fall you plant something, if you plant something 1 week apart, it might be ready 3 weeks apart or even longer, because as you're pushing in towards the winter time, there's less light and less heat, and things just exponentially slow down. So you have to keep that in mind. In the middle of the season, in the summer, you can plant things. If you need a bed of lettuce every week, you can plant a bed of lettuce every week, and they'll come out basically a week apart. So to get good at this, the best thing you do is take notes and keep records that, like, if I plant a bed of lettuce in mid-September and I harvest it in late November, then you'll know how long it takes. Or if you plant it in mid-September and it's not ready till late December, then you'll need to keep that in mind. And that's when you can then go back the next year and figure out when you need to plant things so you have successions and consistent output. So that's kind of how you handle the summer versus the shoulder seasons. Now the winter time is a whole other thing, and I'm gonna make a module about winter growing because it's actually my main season, and I've learned quite a bit in the last few years about it. But with winter growing, you basically have to plant everything ahead of time, and things kind of just, they just maintain. They don't really grow super fast. I mean, here I get some growth when we have a streak of like warm, sunny days, but the light levels are so low that you don't get a lot of growth. So most of what happens is you're planting ahead of time, and then it's just kind of coasting through the winter. You can plant some stuff in the winter time here, but it's so slow that usually by the time spring comes up, everything starts growing super, super quickly, and you have a whole bunch of food. So it's a little bit tricky when you're planting in the winter, but most of the time with the winter, you're planting it in late fall or during the fall, and kind of just harvesting throughout the winter time. Now let's get into my crop planting techniques. And as I said, there's the people that are super detailed and super organized with their crop planting, and there's the people that just wing it. I'm kind of in the middle. And I could definitely improve on this, but what I tend to do is I plan all of my transplants, which is a lot of my, what I'm growing is transplants. So we'll get into that in another module. So I'll plan those out because those have to be done ahead of time. And so for example, if in my succession planting or planning, I need to have a bed of lettuce every week, well then what I'll be doing is I'll be starting my transplants in the nursery. I'll do 1 bed's worth of lettuce every week. Now, once I have all those starts ready to go, there's a constant stream of them. That's what I'm planting out. And when I have extra beds, I will direct seed whatever I have extra beds available. So for me, I direct seed carrots. So those are usually the beds that are just extra that I wind up planting my carrots into. But it'll depend on, what's important for your farm business. And for me, that's kind of what works. It's good to have a couple of crops that you can easily direct seed if you have an open bed. You could use cover crops too if you have more space, but generally I'm growing cash crops. So that's what I do is I plan my transplants and then I direct seed what's left. The other thing about having some direct seeded crops, which is great, is that if crops fail, right, if you put out some transplants and they don't work, you can easily go in and direct seed some crops, and that works really, really well. I also like to have a seasonal crop, so I have my staples, which I mentioned in my crop selection video. I do lettuce, carrots, and beets, and then a seasonal crop. Right now I have patty pan squash planted. It's mid-April. So that's kind of what I do for my crop planting is I have a couple of staples, and then I have 1 seasonal, and that allows some flexibility with what I'm growing, but also kind of keeps things a little bit more interesting because, as I said, with my restaurant accounts, they kind of want the same thing every week, and then giving them some seasonality and letting them know ahead of time they can plan for that, and they get excited about having seasonal crops. Good timing is crucial for executing your crop plan. And as I said, for me, I do most of my planning with my transplants. So when I start a bunch of seeds, I know that in 3 or 4 weeks, I'm gonna need to have beds ready for them. And you need to make sure that the beds are ready for those transplants. And that's where a lot of this crop planning comes into play. Also, you don't want to leave empty beds. This is bad for a few reasons. Remember, with the no-till practices and living soil, one of the best things you need to do is keep the ground covered, keep the ground planted. So you always want to have something growing in the ground. If it's not a cash crop, it's a cover crop. But if you don't have, a bed planted with some sort of cash crop on a small acreage like this, you're losing money. So make sure that your plan is you have enough beds for your transplants, but you're also keeping them full. And I think that's where the balance of transplanting and direct seeding really come into play here to keep your beds nice and full. Let me jump in here real quick and take a minute to talk about our sponsor, PaperPot Co. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, this entire course wouldn't be possible without the support of Diego and PaperPot Co. Diego is not just the owner of PaperPot Co., he's also an unbelievable podcaster and YouTuber. I highly recommend you check out his podcast, Farm Small, Farm Smart. It was a huge inspiration for myself as I was getting into farming and learning how to grow food. He's interviewed hundreds of farmers, including myself a few times if you want to go check that out. And there's a lot of great information in there about farm business and growing techniques. Diego is a huge proponent of farm education, as you can tell by sponsoring this course. There's a lot of great things over at the PaperPot Co. website in terms of tools and equipment and supplies. I really recommend you go check it out. They really focus on high quality stuff, great customer service, and being a reliable place to buy things from. Also, there are additional resources over on the PaperPot Co. website for this course, so check that out at paperpot.co/Josh. Thanks PaperPot Co. for sponsoring this, and go check out what they have and let them know that you're enjoying this course as well. Back to the module. Transplanting is a huge part of the strategy here on my farm, and there's a bunch of reasons for that. Now, I'll get into specific transplanting techniques in a later module, but I want to talk overall about why I love transplanting so much. When you're on small acreage, you need to do anything you can to increase your yields to become profitable, and transplanting is one of those ways. And the reason for that is when you are starting seeds in your nursery and getting them to grow, they have 3 or 4 weeks of growth before they even get into the ground. Now, the beds that they're being transplanted in have another crop in them, so you're not quite doubling each bed, but maybe 1.5 times in each bed, because you're having things grow ahead of time before they even grow in the ground. This will give you more yield, of course, because you're getting, more output per bed. The other thing I love about transplanting is that you can select the transplants going into the ground and just put out the healthiest transplants, and you can get an exact density. And we'll talk more about that, as I said, in the specific transplanting module. but it really is helpful to get really solid stands and really high yields because you can put out exactly what you want. And what I found is that, especially with soil blocks and my nursery management stuff, which I'll get into later, I've just been getting huge yields with transplants. And the other thing, there's certain crops that need different temperatures to germinate, and if you put them out in the warm soil out here in the tunnels, sometimes they may not germinate, for example, like lettuce in the warmer months. So as I said, we'll get into nursery management and soil blocks and transplanting later, but transplanting is a huge part of the farm here because I can get a lot more yield per bed. Knowing your yield on each crop and how much you can get out of each bed will really help you determine your crop planning and your succession planning for future seasons. And this will come with time and experience and record keeping. And as you get better, you can increase your yields. Now, a lot of people ask me about, can you get more than one cut on lettuce, for example? And what I like to say is I only plan on one cut. And if I get a second cut, it's just kind of bonus. Now in the warmer months, I don't even think about a second cut. I harvest the lettuce and it comes out, something else goes in right away. Because the later cuts, well, the summertime, no way for lettuce, but the later cuts on any crop is gonna be usually less yield and slightly less quality. And for me, I always focus on getting the best quality to my customers. Now, if I cut the lettuce and I come back in a couple weeks and it is looking good, then yes, I will use it, but I don't plan on it, if that makes sense. It's kind of like a bonus thing for me. And I'll get into more of that with the harvesting module. Now, there's other techniques with certain crops like thin harvesting, which I do for beets. So I'll go through and just pull just the big ones out so I can get, and then in the next few weeks, the small ones will grow to bigger ones. And so that allows me to harvest off one bed for multiple weeks. But of course, if you need a whole bed coming out at once, you can't do that. But another thing is carrots. Like I won't usually harvest a whole bed of carrots in 1 week. I'll go through and just take what I need. So, that will depend a lot on how much you need for each week and how much you can get off each bed, going back to knowing your yields. Some things are continual harvest. So some things like, tomatoes, you'll be harvesting for a long time off the same bed. And then other things like kale, like full-size kale, I can harvest off that for an extended period of time. So you have to learn each crop and what your yields are going to be, and keep in mind that some crops you just crop the whole thing out, and sometimes you can continuously crop it for a while. Interplanting can also be a great way to increase the output on your farm, and this is a more advanced technique, and I'll talk about this a little bit in the interplanting module. It is a way to increase the output and increase the diversity in your soil, which is important for creating living soil, but it's not a beginner technique, and I don't recommend doing that until you really master all the crops that you're putting into one bed and learn how they affect each other and their days to maturity. I can't stress this enough, keep records, and I am, as I said, not great about doing this, but if you can keep track of when you plant something, when you harvest it, and the yields that you get, you can then use that for future seasons to determine your crop planning and know what you can expect out of each crop at a certain time of year, and that will be valuable for you as you develop your crop plan and grow your farm business. Experimentation should be kept to a minimum. Don't go crazy with it, but it's always good to experiment a little bit because you always want to be tweaking things along the way. But as I said in my crop selection video module, make sure that you're starting with a small amount of crops, learning how to grow them well, and learning, how to expect what you should get out of them. And that way you can use that to, build your crop plan and have beds that are really full and have the maximum amount of yield for your farm business. Have some flexibility with your crop plan. As I said in my sort of personal crop plan, I plan my transplants and then I use direct seeding to fill in. Also have extra starts around, extra transplants, because crops fail. Also, you could direct seed something and it would have, spotty germination. You can fill that in with head lettuce or something like that. So having some extra starts is always really helpful. Keep your beds full. Make sure you have a maximum yield whenever possible so you can be making as much money for your farm business. Lots of great stuff coming up, and remember, live Q&As every Monday at 3 p.m. Eastern. We'll be going over the module from a few days prior. The next module, Module 8, will be all about tunnels, so hope to see you then.